It's our pleasure that we have Pratibha Ji today with us, who's a renowned classical dancer, Bharatanatyam proponent, and a very multifaceted personality. She was a child prodigy, and she was already established as a dancer, with great dancer by the time she was 20. But it doesn't stop there. She's also a feminist. She uses her art to propagate and strengthen messages which create for a stronger democracy. She's also an institution builder. She's helped establish and support international arts festivals, including the Delhi International Arts Festival. And we are very happy that she's going to speak to us today on the feminine in the Indian classical dance. Ma'am, we are very grateful that you took time and came to speak to us. And I'd like to welcome you.
I was pretty excited when I got the invitation because normally classical dancers are invited to give lecture demonstrations of their art forms. Apart from the regular performances that we do, where we do not really interact with our audience except when they come backstage to meet us and give us a feedback of what the performance was about. But these kinds of fora help the artists grow also, because like you said, there has to be a spirit of inquiry, a spirit of revisiting the body of knowledge that all of us know, because unless we revisit it, unless from time to time, and unless we start a process of critical inquiry, there will be no growth or no development. Having said that, Shabnam ji asked me to choose a topic, and I said my topic would be the feminine in classical dance, because as a woman, as a performer, as a person living in a very strange world, a mixed world, where on the one hand you see people who are truly educated and truly liberated and truly live the thought of gender equality, you're also subjected to male gaze, male domination and male persecution time and again in the field that a performer, a woman performer operates. We'll just place before you some theories that have intrigued me, some imagery that you see often enough in dance but you don't question or think about beyond the fact that it looks beautiful or divine. To enter into a discussion on any aspect of Indian classical dance is to enter into a discourse on ethics, aesthetics and social reality all at once. It's a complex and layered subject with mythology, history and the present intertwined and forefronted simultaneously, and therefore it's very challenging to come out with a single theory of what is depicted and seen as to be the only and the actual. So what I'm trying to really say is that you have a combination of narrative of mythology, you have the Puranas, the legends, the historical perspectives, you have a body of literature, and when you see a classical dance form, you are forefronted side by side with all these aspects. So you cannot really, distinguish one from the other. I mean, one item may be on some Devi, the next item would be on a Naika, the third item would be on some, Mother Teresa or something. So you really are wondering whether, it's at once that you have legend, mythology, history, social reality, all forefronted and set before you in motion. So the feminine in classical dance is again multi-layered. While you have the goddess, like I said, and their supreme power as creators, on the one hand, there are the Nayikas. The Nayikas are the heroines whom you are often confronted with when you go to a classical dance performance. She's the heroine of the dance form. So you have the Nayikas and their eternal longing for union with the male god on the other. The physical and the metaphysical, two intertwine at many, many levels. The physical female dancer is very special because Bharata, the author of Natya Shastra, that is generally accepted as the performative text of the art of theatrical practice, with dance being one of the aspects of theatre, speaks only of the female dancer when he describes the attributes of the dancer. But what I'm trying to say is that when Bharata speaks about the dancer, when he speaks about the actor, he says nut and nutty. There is the male actor and then there is the female actor. But when he speaks about the dancer and the attributes of the dancer, he speaks only of the female form. He never gives anything about the attributes of a male dancer. This address that he makes is to the feminine body. He says, a dancer should be neither too tall nor too short, neither too fat nor too thin. She has to have high bosom, slim waist, and she has to be prasannamukhi, person with a smiling face. It is clear that the original dancer was conceived, therefore, as feminine, though we refer to Nataraja as the god of dance, and to Krishna as Natnagar, lord of dance. This is probably because the female is considered in our culture as both the creator and creativity itself. So we have a mythology where the female is the creator and creativity. So she's both the dominant and the kinetic in the process of creation. The Natya Shastra text provides a point of orientation for both agreements and disagreements to emerge on extremely complex and hotly debated issues in the arts and in classical dance. Is aesthetic pleasure a matter of experience or cognitive understanding? Classical dances of India have always encapsulated, both in form and content, the philosophical aspirations of the Indian mind. So, the internal evidence of the Natya Shastra enables us to contextualize the text within the larger matrix of the Indian cultural traditions at the level of concept, speculative thought, mythology, and ritual traditions, both Vedic and others. For those dancers who say that dance is secular, my humble submission is that when we talk about Indian classical dance, we are not talking about secularism as we know of it today, or in the manner that the politicians speak of it today. We're talking about a certain body of thought, a concept, an idea, a speculative thought, a mythology, the Vedic traditions, Puranas, and the stories that came thereof, and how the dancer interprets these. There never was. The stories are a peg to hang the entire classical structure to. The stories were not the quintessence of dance itself. Though most of the stories, because the texts were important, most of the stories are about the gods and the goddesses. I want to deal with how classical dance deals with the complex nexus of human passion and desire by transforming the instinctive urges into positive and well-defined channels of expression. I want to place before you 4 mutually exclusive representations of female embodiment in dance that is valid, that is often seen, and is generally accepted. We view the whole gamut of sexuality and sacred as mutually exclusive categories. The belief that the sacred religious can be carnal or even evoke faint traces of sensuality is unacceptable. Though it's the feminine body, sexual, yes, real, yes, absolute and active, yes, you cannot associate that sexuality or sensuality of the goddess with the carnal, with desire. The primary depiction of the feminine is therefore as the sacred, Devi, Lakshmi, Saraswati, pure, untainted by senses or emotions, and holy and whole by themselves, non-dependent on the male counterpart. Now please understand that when we talk about the Devi cult, the Shakti cult, and we talk about the original Lakshmi, not the Lakshmi you see later with Vishnu, but Lakshmi, and Saraswati as a body of knowledge, they're complete in themselves, they're whole in themselves, and they're not dependent on the male counterpart. The Shakti heritage, Durga's triumph, Saraswati's wisdom, Lakshmi's bounty, Parvati's love, and the wrath of Devi Mahakali are depicted in its purest form in the dance form, in the dances of India. Absolutely non-domesticated. These goddesses are absolutely non-domesticated. They're single and they're wild. So you have the imagery of the single goddess who does not need male protection, who does not talk about being born of a father or giving birth to a son through a husband or a lover. No, these are full entities in themselves. And they are pure in what they're supposed to do and what they're supposed to represent. They're single, they're wild, and they're non-domesticated. So here, Shakti or Devi or this goddess is seen as an extension of earth, a Panchabhuta, a pure element in its mysterious manifestation of cosmic fecundity. So fertility of the Bhuta, of Mother Earth, of course, is something that we associate the Mother Goddess with. So, and therefore, Prakriti, we talk in the feminine. We talk about Earth in the feminine, because, you know, the Earth is fertile, and this fecundity, the abundance of fecundity that we see around, when you say fecundity, you're talking of abundant fertility, you know, which you associate with the Goddess, which, you know, with the Goddess can bless us with. So you must have seen, all of you, a lot of, or danced, Kanakaji, songs of Devi, songs of Lakshmi, songs of, you know, Parvati, songs of Mahakali. What are you talking about them? You're saying that here she is, her form, she's beautiful, she's resplendent, she's got this magical, beautiful eyes, she's got long nose, she's got beautiful lips, but she's ferocious. She can be kind, she can be soft, she can be bold, she can be, all the rasas that you're talking about, we say Navarasas, Ashtabhavas, we say that all these 8 bhavas can be, you know, transmuted to the goddess. So the goddess is seen, you know, as Veera, as Rautra, as Bhayanaka, as, not exactly, sometimes Vibhatsa, when you see Kali with her tongue hanging, and, you know, you have that image of that thing. So these are dance forms that you must be seeing when the dancer enters the stage. She will not take up a Nayaka or a Nayaki bhava or an emotional or a man-woman relationship or anything right in the beginning of a dance performance. No. The first item, any dancer in any of the Indian classical dance forms that you see, a performance, will do a song of the absolute God. And here I'm talking of the feminine. When you see gods portrayed in dance, in pieces that retell the epics, you observe that gods are portrayed as beings of power. The forces that influence their course of action are usually absolutist. It's absolute, unquestionable. A diktat of dharma of which they uphold. Whether it is Nataraja's Thandava, a dance that showcases the primal strength of Lord Shiva and his power that transcends everything, life, death, creation, destruction, recreation, and the forces beyond. It never once sheds light on Shiva himself, the human Shiva, but the Shiva, the human being. We're just talking of his absolute power of creation, recreation, destruction, his attributes, his glory, and his munificence, his magnificence, and cosmic reality. But we never talk about, was he sad ever? Was he lonely ever? What is he as a human being? We never ever question Shiva the human. And through dance I'm talking about when I say all this. Why do you think this happens? Because the human and the emotional is perceived to be weak. And so you cannot have this God who is all-powerful, omnipresent, omniscient, being even seen in like a fraction of a second as being weak. Because it will take away his absolutist capabilities. This is the stereotype of what it is to be masculine and divine. The power to protect, the power to destroy, and discarding the person behind the power. as to be human is to be weak. This is also evidenced by Lord Rama's portrayal as a powerful protector of dharma, who does as commanded without once showcasing how he feels. How did he feel, Lord Rama, about, his wife going away, about him going, upholding dharma, having his wife get into the fire? Did he feel something? I mean, did he question it? Did he tell her, no, don't get into the fire? Did he even question himself? No. And why do people not question that? Because he is perceived as the upholder of dharma in his absolute form, not as a human with weaknesses of emotion or internal kind of questioning. Lord Krishna, however, is more human than most of the gods that you see in the Hindu pantheon of gods, and therefore I think dancers love to present Krishna. So in any performance that you go, you will see Krishna being performed, because Krishna is generally perceived as an androgynous god, with the male, female, the yin yang, whatever you want to the theories that you talk about in himself, of the qualities of the masculine and the feminine equal in proportion in the persona of Krishna. So he shows empathy, he shows love, he shows compassion, he's an artist, he's a statesman, he's a political, he lies, he cheats, he does things that we know all of us relate to. So we will not bring Krishna into this, this theory of the absolute male, masculine depiction in dance. The goddess, the feminine, and the portrayal in dance, however, is more human, so to speak. I was speaking to you about Shakti, that's why I'm, and the absolutist power of Shakti. So therefore I'm trying to tell you what I mean. While their power is depicted on par with the gods, if not greater in their portrayal, more emotion is showcased when you depict any of the feminine forms, whether it be Devi or Shakti or even Mahakali. You show emotion. You don't show her in her absolute non-emotional, form. So therefore you have the mother's love for her creation, the mother's will to protect, the mother's rage when her offsprings are hurt or demonic forces destroy the peace of the land. The mother's grief go hand in hand with the feminine divine. Yeah? So, and it also, while it goes hand in hand, all these aspects of the mother, it rather emulates her to give the dance a human touch. Therefore, when you dance Devi, you are smiling, you are you are Vatsalya. Vatsalya, the mother's love for her child. You're protecting, you're angry, you're You show so many different aspects of it. Benign qualities of the Supreme Mother. And then you ask her blessings. The dancers don't portray much, the feminine divine in their absolutist power. But a skilled dancer projects this power over her audience, which gives the power to art rather than the banal abhinaya or the retelling of the epics. So when you create the imagery of a mother goddess, and at the end of it, you've already transferred a certain energy onto your audience in terms of emotional energy, of all the, some of the rasas that come in your, in the bhavas, the ashtabhavas. So the Puranas or the myths emerged about how powerful warrior gods forced wild goddesses into submission. Unattached, the mother goddess was feared. Her powers were considered untamable, hence dangerous. To check her powers and to make her more tameable, she had to be absorbed by the superior male counterpart. So, you understand what I'm saying? So the Puranas now, they say, no, there is this wild goddess who's got absolute power, who's, the force of creation, destruction, protection, everything. So how can we let that happen? So then there are the Puranas who talk about these warrior gods. So these gods find these goddesses dangerous and they want to absorb them to make them more tameable, to make them more, controllable. It's a control mechanism. The androgynous iconography, and with it several hymns are used in classical dance, to show the equality and interdependence between the masculine and the feminine forces in cosmic creation. From being singularly responsible for creation, the feminine now becomes equal in power and energy to the masculine force. So the moment you talk of Ardhanarishwara, her absolute power has reduced to half. So you have the masculine energy that is, merged with her. So half is male, half is female. So these two, male and female, are complementary to each other, and together they are responsible for the creation, preservation, and the recreation of the world. So they have already tamed her. They've brought her. They've convinced her she has to be now equal to man, not superior to man. So this warrior god has, absorbed the warrior goddess. So we have Ardhanarishwara. The most popular imagery that is danced to show this cosmic complementarity is the archetypal image of Ardhanarishwara, Shiva and Shakti, in a half male, half female form. Earlier, when they spoke about Ardhanarishwara and they danced Ardhanarishwara, they just depicted the concept of Ardhanarishwara. The imagery, the iconographic imagery of Ardhanarishwara. Here is the man, here is the thing, here is he with Raudra, here is she smiling, and here is he with the, in this side he has the thing, and she with the bindi, and things like that. And he ferocious, she smiling, that kind of a thing throughout. So you go, he, with the chest like a, flat-chested like the mountain, and she with rounded bosom. And you go on till the feet. So there are various interpretations of this iconography you see through dance. And now dancers have come to speak about its most feminist version of interpreting the Ardhanarishwara. They say it is the cosmic depiction and revelation of gender equality and interdependence of the male and the female. So the feminists today take the concept of Ardhanarishwara to talk about how, even there's a cosmic sanction to gender equality and gender complementarity. The story, of course, is different. The story states that Brahma found it hard to continue with creation because most creatures that he created stopped reproducing. So he therefore propitiated Shiva to assume his androgynous form. This polar form of Shiva split into Shiva and Parvati, or Shiva and Shakti, and at Brahma's request, it begins to multiply and function as the archetypal mother and the father of the universe. Though many liken this form of Shiva and Shakti to Radha Krishna, according to me, these analogies are dissimilar and vastly different. Even though the androgynous form of Radha Krishna, again, is perceived as a singular purpose of unity, of creation, it in truth shows the triumph and perseverance of bhakti in unifying the mortal with Godhood, the fruits of single-minded devotion that can unite you with God, with the Lord of your longing. Now these are completely dissimilar and vastly different. Shiva and Shakti are male-female energies that are together. Radha and Krishna are the mortal and the immortal coming together in unity of mind and purpose. So the mortal's longing, devotion, bhakti, perseverance to overcome the hurdles of sanskara, life, emotions, everything, to reach Godhood and finally submerge into God. So that concept of unity of Radha and Krishna is vastly dissimilar, according to me, to the concept of Shiva and Shakti and Ardhanarishwara. So the delineation of the dance too of these forms is vastly different. Radha's love is represented as the highest ideal of religious rapture, experienced through erotic sentiment, Madhura Rasa. Towards this union, the emotions grow from the most mundane to absolute sublimation through immersing the passionate sports of Krishna and Radha. Radha is shown as an ordinary woman who is in love with a regular guy. She doesn't consider Krishna God. So she's in love with this man. She's also a parakiya. She's a married woman. So here you've also broken societal norms of saying that a married woman, mortal, can pine and long for the supreme being, God. So there are no societal restrictions imposed on her here. And she goes through this whole sport and play, you know, in Vrindavan. She's angry, she's longing for him, waiting for him. She sees him in dalliance with other gopikas. She's hurt, she's, you know, angered. She's frustrated. She's you know, feels that her friends have actually deserted her and taken Krishna away from her. And Krishna comes. He begs her forgiveness, but she's not in the mood to forgive him. She gets angry with him and asks him to go away. Says, "You've hurt me. You've been with other women. How can I accept you? Go away." But Krishna then, you know, falls at her feet, asks for her forgiveness, and then we have this final two songs where we talk about Radha and Krishna submerging into one being and becoming one. So where there is no ego, where there is no self, where there is no expectation, where there is no social reality, then you are one with the divine being, with the supreme being. And that really is the story of Krishna and Radha's androgynous form. All devotees of Krishna therefore consider themselves in their spiritual experience as feminine, because Krishna is believed to be the sole Purusha, the Purushottama, the supreme male. Because embedded deep in this belief of Radha and Krishna is another alternative school of thought, where it is perceived that Krishna is the only Purusha, the only Purushottama, the only male, and that all beings on earth, male or female, are all in the feminine. They are all in the feminine gender. Because the most intimate, the closest relationship that can ever be achieved is between a male and a female form. In this school of thought of androgynous, androgyny of the male-female union. The human soul, striving for spiritual evolution, is at the center of this idea that forms the basis of all classical dance depictions. Striving for spiritual evolution is therefore conceived as a woman. The human soul itself is conceived as a woman in the feminine gender, a celestial energy of the divine. The theory of femininity further holds that as long as a person lives by his individual male personhood, identified with petty, undiscerning ego, one cannot enter into blissful love plane of the divine. So Professor A.K. Ramanujan says, and I quote, "Women are secure in their identities and hence do not need to undergo a conversion or change their sex. Anthropologists have pointed out that males have elaborate initiation rites because they have to be weaned away from their mothers and given a separate masculine identity in order to enter the male world. Men have to change to become themselves. Only after the change may they long for the earlier feminine identification with the mother figure. Women, by contrast, may continue to identify with the mothers. The women saints, of the Bhakti movement, the women saints, never had to convert their sex to reach godhood. They may fight the male, they fought the male in the husband, priest, elder, father. She may love a male deity, but she remains feminine. She rejoices in the identity of being feminine. Whereas the male Bhakti points, including Chaitanya and Mahaprabhu and all of them, had to change their identity into becoming a woman in order to reach godhood. So we have finished two now, okay? One is the absolute, the other is the androgynous of the male-female. I come to the third. In the reproductive model, perhaps the earliest paradigm of controlling the female. So why do you control feminine? Why do you control female? Because it's convenient to do so, because we're talking of reproduction. Just as man conquers earth, he conquers woman. I mean, that's a very, very early feminist kind of a, statement. So in the reproductive model, perhaps the earliest paradigm of controlling the female, the woman's body is framed through a prism of fertility. The unhindered goddess, therefore, becomes a consort. The psychological shift, as reflected in human society, makes the goddess a wife. Now this goddess, you're looking at the psychological shift in society itself, when you come to Manusmriti and thereafter. And so this goddess, the untamed goddess, who then took on the form of the androgynous goddess, now becomes the wife, a consort. Her freedom is curtailed, her faithfulness is touted as the hallmark of all feminine virtue. She is depicted subservient to her husband's will. Like the earth, she is man's property. Patriarchy sets in full force, and the vision of a Lakshmi sitting at the feet of Vishnu and pressing his feet is projected as the ultimate role of feminine virtue. Legends associated with Sri Lakshmi personify her as the model of marital contentment, as in the domestic order, righteous behavior and feminine grace. Despite the fact that the religious ideal of marriage lauded the complementarity between the sexes, on the social plane, however, the system supports absolute male dominance over women. Even today, when you hear voices, emerging from society, when horrible things like rape and, gender violence and, those kinds of things happen, they're all talking with this, from this perspective of patriarchy. They're not sensitive to the fact that the woman is an equal partner. So it's with the sense of that power and patriarchy that you hear these voices. The unusual importance that India gives to the sacrament of marriage made the untamed goddess of the wild a demure, coy, chaste village goddess, whose virtues and talents ensured the good fortune of her husband and family. The untamed goddess of the wild was for the benefit of all of Prakriti itself, all of creation. And here, the consort, the wife, the tamed, domesticated goddess becomes a village goddess. She's demure, she's coy, and her, virtues and her talents benefit only her husband and his family. The control was complete. Without a woman by his side, a man could not become a grihapati. Grihapati is a householder, right? And an yajamana is a person who performs ritual rites. So without a woman, without a wife, a man could not become a householder. So this whole thing was about, fertility and procreation. So why do you have a woman? Why do you have a husband? So that you can procreate and you can, further your duties as a householder and as a yajamana, the righteous duties of yajamana. Though the sacredness of the feminine was acknowledged, every attempt was made to curtail her freedom. Therefore, the embellishments of the veil you see in dance, when a woman goes out of her house, she's in the house. She's doing all her, the regular course of, getting water from the well. You see all these things, putting water, drinking it, cooking, making butter, feeding people, happy, adorning herself, having a bath, pleasing herself, making herself so pleasant that when her husband comes back, you should say, hey, she's looking so beautiful. So waiting for her husband, looking for him. All those embellishments, looking at the child, and putting the child to sleep, feeding the child, telling the husband, look at the child, whole day, he bothered me. Basically, I'm inside. The moment she steps out of her threshold, what does she do? She picks up the veil, covers herself, and then walks, demurely looks, and see if anybody's looking at her. No, she's not supposed to even meet gaze. Because she is a goddess of her own house, not the universe that she was meant to be. And you see the depiction of this also in classical dance, mostly this these days. So yeah, like I said, she's taking care of her children, family, cooking, feeding, adorning herself to appear pleasing to her husband and doing whatever makes him happy. This showed the female trapped within thresholds and smothered by the alleged divinity of chaste wives and loving matriarchs. I mean, you keep giving these analogies You know, and talking about, oh, you have to be chaste, chaste, chaste wife, virtue, chastity, you know, and loving matriarchs look after. What happens to her sexual being? What about the woman's sexuality? The man cannot deal with that sexuality or that sensuality. So therefore he has to tame her, control her, make her a wife, make her a mother, put her in the house, and make her cover herself, because her unbridled beauty is something he fears and cannot confront as reality. So this is my third woman of the feminine in dance. The fourth, who is now very, very, very popular, and there's a reason to it also, a historical reason to it, is the Naika. Set apart from the husband, obeying, dutiful wife, the more interesting depiction in classical dance is of the Naika as a paradigm of female embodiment. The Naika as a heroine of free love. What is a Naika? A Naika is a Devadasi. She is a musician, she is a scholar, she is learned, she is a dancer, she is an empowered woman. But the most important of all these, you know, whatever, things of empowerment is the fact that she has free choice. Her choice is not limited. So she is a woman of her own right. Vinayaka as a heroine of free love represents power, independence and virile strength unharnessed by male control. She could be likened to a courtesan, like I said, though not always. She is a ganika, or a woman given to pleasure. Men are mesmerized by her and captivated by her beauty, which is all the more enhanced by her forbidden sexual mystique. Now here is the single, sexual, beautiful woman, learned, independent, not controlled by norms set by society. She dances, she sings, she's a scholar, she's beautiful. Now what is her sexual mystique? Who is the man behind her? Is there a man behind her? Why does she have a choice when other women don't have a choice? So therefore, you know, you call her names, you put her away from society, call her a courtesan, call her a woman of failed virtues and things like that. Though she's very, very akin to the goddess, the primal goddess that we saw in the first state of being. In the Bharatanatyam dance that I practice, the most important depiction through dance is that of the Naika in her many moods. The whole classical structure is sometimes pegged on the single woman and the story of her requited or unrequited love. The whole evening you dance about this Naika, many different Naikas, and the whole story of her requited love or her unrequited love, as the case may be. From its formative period in the 7th to 9th century onwards, South Indian poetry was permeated by erotic themes and images. In South Indian poetry, especially of the Tamil Shaiva Nayanas or the Vaishnava Alvars, God appears as a lover in roles inherited from the so-called Sangam period, filled with emotion of the man-woman nature. A historical continuum stretches from these Tamil poets of devotion all the way to Kshatriya and Sarangapani, a millennium later. The Nayakas, or the central heroines of all this rich body of literature, rich body of poetry, sang to their deities in the temples, who then represented to them real gods in flesh and blood with all emotional and sensuous intensity. Most of these classical dance forms were practiced and performed by special people called Devadasis. Now the Devadasis did not belong to any of the castes of the so-called known caste structure. They were not Brahmins, they were not Vaishyas, they were not Shudras, and they were not Kshatriyas. So they were the fifth caste, the Devadasis. The Devadasis lived within the precincts of the temple. The temple wholly and solely maintained them, and their duty was to dance or sing in the Garbhagriha, the sanctum sanctorum of the temples. They did that. So when we say they're particular deities, they sang songs of that particular deity. Now let's say it's Brihadishvara in the temple in Tanjore. So the Devadasis who lived in this temple, of Brihadishvara in Tanjore, they composed songs on this particular god, made him a mortal. They kind of, absorbed him as a mortal in flesh and blood and spoke to him as a woman longing for her lover. So all this rich body of, poetry talks about this Naika, heroine, and the attributes of this god in that temple, the deity in the temple. Why don't you come to me? I'm longing for you. Days have passed, nights have passed, I have not eaten, look at me. You told me you'll come back soon, but you haven't come, I'm longing for you. On a spiritual plane, like I've explained before, this woman longing, woman waiting, was the longing of the mortal for union with the divine. And this is something, but Devadasis never did that. I mean, they didn't give this bhakti or spiritual angle to their dance form. In raw emotion, with raw active emotion and sexual emotion, virile emotion, they danced these dances to these gods and said, come, become real, come to us, absorb us, come in union with us. We can't be without you. It was not even called Bharatanatyam at that time. It was called Sadar in Tamil Nadu, it was called Karnatakam in Karnataka, it was called Andhra in the Andhra region. This art form, they called it the dance of Bharata, properly, dance that takes its narrative and its body of, science, the grammatical science of the Natya Shastra, and so they probably called it Bharatanatyam. In North India today they say Bharatnatyam. It is not Bharat ki Natyam, Bharatnatyam, it's Bharatanatyam, Natya Shastra, Bharata is Natya Shastra, and therefore Bharatanatyam. Other scholars say that in Bharata, Bha is Bhava, emotion, Ra is Raga, which is, musical narrative to which the dance is danced, and Tal is the rhythm, Tala. So Bharata is what many other scholars also, break this word, Bharatanatyam to Bharata, Bhara and Ta. So the fact that this dance form was sustained and practiced by the Devadasis until the early 20th century further explains this rich body of work, the way the literature formed, I'm talking about, and the reason why excellence is in depiction of these emotions is considered the pinnacle of artistry in dance. The movement by British to abolish all Devadasis endangered a valuable part of culture, all that related to song and dance. Women from regular families started learning dance only after independence, and attempts were made by early dancers to keep Shringara or erotic love to the minimum and camouflage the intent of the poetry through bhakti or devotion. The trend became to reinterpret sexual references and representations in texts, rituals and art by assigning exalted spiritual meanings to them. They believed this made them respectable and ensured that more and more girls from middle-class, so-called respectable families learned dance. A movement in the 80s, however, brought this erotic poetry back to center stage, more as a movement towards unashamedness in expressing sensuality and desire to the god hero. The Nayaka in these poems has come into her own. The balance of power between the male and female has once again dramatically shifted. It is the male god, hero, who frequently loses himself in this Nayika, while she is capable of toying with her lover, feigning anger, or mercilessly teasing him. She may also be languishing or be abandoned by him for a younger counterpart, but yet she embodies a mode of experiencing the divine that is characterized by emotional freedom, concrete physical satisfaction, and active control. Quite like the goddess of myth and the Nayika of dance is the classical dancer of today. She is strong, she is empowered. She celebrates her body and is mentally agile and sharp. She chooses what she wishes to do, and in that choice is her empowerment. Quite in the manner of the goddess, many are desirous of her, many secretly lust for her, many wish to tame her, and many others want to domesticate her. For in her freedom, in her control of her mind, in her control of her body, and in her unbridled beauty and strength lie the fears and insecurities of her male audience. Dance celebrates the feminine in all its aspects, and the feminine celebrates dance in all its aspects. And I must tell you that when many have asked me how I feel dancing these dances, I call myself the feminist Naika. Thank you.